Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. And for this episode, this will be movies number 470 through 475. And if you watched the last episode of CraterMania Christmas Classics, you know that I'm kind of going with an ongoing theme here now with just a lot of the classic movies that we all grew up with, since we were kids, and some of us who just maybe just introduced to them here as of recent. I just wanted to kind of cover all of those, in the last episode, I did several different ones, and then that what I consider Christmas classics, such as It's a Wonderful Life and just a Christmas Story, and some of the other ones that I talked about. Well, I just want to continue that now with part two of Crater Mania Christmas Classics. Um, and these are absolutely a lot of films that I grew up with and that I absolutely love and I watch every year around this time of year, and some of them I even watch multiple times throughout the year. I mean, so that it doesn't have to just be around the Christmas season for me to watch some of these movies. Some of these I consider just absolute favorites of mine, just in as far as films in general go. And definitely, this first movie I'm gonna be talking about tonight is definitely one of those films that I think, even though it is based around Christmas, it's one of those films that you can just watch any time of year. And I've noticed on the internet in the past several years, like there's a big debate about this movie, whether it's an actual Christmas movie or not. And I 100% think that this is a Christmas movie. I think that any movie out there, if it's based around the Christmas, just because if it isn't the typical, Christmas movie with Santa Claus and just an overwhelming like good feeling and just about family and just the joy of the holiday and all that, it doesn't have to be that, just to be a Christmas movie, in my opinion. If it's based around the Christmas holiday, then it's 100% a Christmas movie. And, of course, you probably figured out what movie I'm talking about by now, and that's Die Hard from 1988. Die Hard is a film that just has grown to become this cult classic. And it's just, it's now widely regarded, I think, as one of the greatest action movies ever made. Um, and while it was, initially marketed as this summer blockbuster, that whole Christmas Eve setting, I feel like has ensured its place in just that world, of beloved holiday films for a lot of people, including myself. And just, as a fan who grew up, loving both action movies and Christmas classics, Die Hard, occupies that special place, in that kind of filmography of my childhood. It's a film that effortlessly, bridges these two genres. And I had my dad to thank for a lot of that because my dad was always into action movies, and he loved Bruce Willis. So I think I've talked about my dad before on here, how he was the one that kind of got me into horror movies. Well, my dad was also the one that got me into action movies as well. So really have my dad to thank for that, for my love for Die Hard. Like I said, it's a film that just effortlessly, bridges those two genres, and it defies, any kind of expectations, and just, it carves out this unique identity, for itself that has just resonated with, with audiences for decades now. Um, from the moment it was released, Die Hard stood out for, its gritty realism and just that high stakes action. But its Christmas setting introduced this kind of unique layer, of holiday elements that elevated it, beyond just a mere action movie. Um, and the film's main character here, John McClane, portrayed by Bruce Willis, is this relatable, guy. He's just this determined guy who just embodies the spirit of both, the action genre and the Christmas holiday. His struggle against, these terrorists at Nakatomi Plaza is not only, like this battle of survival, but just also this kind of deeply, personal journey of reconciliation with his estranged wife, Holly. And as someone who has always cherished, that emotional depth of Christmas stories, I've always found this aspect of Die Hard particularly compelling. Um, while some may debate whether, like I said, whether Die Hard truly qualifies as a Christmas movie, I think there's no denying, that immense popularity that it has, especially around this time of year. Its legacy as this winter classic, if you want to call it that, even if you don't want to call it a Christmas movie, it's a winter classic. And I think it continues to grow, with new generations, discovering, its thrills and that nostalgic charm that it has, each year. And Die Hard remains this perfect blend, of just that high octane, just that high octane action and that holiday, sentiment, just making it this kind of unforgettable, experience for fans of both of those genres. Um, and this was directed by John McTiernan, and it was written by Jeb Stewart and Stephen D'Souza. I think that's how you say his last name. But Die Hard is just this action film that's since become this defining entry in the genre of action films. And it was based on Roderick Thorpe's 1979 novel Nothing Lasts Forever. And so the film follows this NYPD detective John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, who just he finds himself in this middle of a life threatening situation on Christmas Eve. And so because he's visiting Los Angeles to see his estranged wife Holly, and he arrives at this place where she works, Nakatomi Plaza, for this holiday party. Just discovered that this building is being taken over by this group of these heavily armed, terrorists, led by Hans Gruber, played by Alan Rickman. And what begins as this kind of simple family reunion quickly turns into this like desperate battle for survival as John McClane, the sole individual that has not become a hostage of this situation. He has to use his wits and his combat skills, to outsmart these criminals and protect all those inside, including his wife. Um, so John McTiernan's direction brings this very tense, grounded realism to the film. Just with many of the scenes, that are filmed on location, in and around Los Angeles's Fox Plaza. And the film's success was far from certain, as industry insiders had, initially doubted the potential of Bruce Willis, that was who was at the time best known for television work like the show Moonlighting. So putting him in this leading role in this film, despite early skepticism, Die Hard proved to be this surprise hit, and it grossed over $140 million, at the box office, and it became one of the top grossing films of the year 1988. It and its commercial success and that critical reevaluation just over the years has solidified its place, as this classic film. Um, just with just the fast paced sequences and that tight script that it has, and just these unforgettable performances, especially from Bruce Willis, and also of course the legendary Alan Rickman's iconic portrayal of Hans Gruber. Die Hard has become this benchmark, for action films. It not only revitalized the genre in the late 1980s, but it just it also set that standard for future action blockbusters. Um, and Die Hard's story is this masterclass in just high stakes action, suspense. Like I said, on Christmas Eve, John is traveling to Los Angeles, to attempt to kind of mend that fractured relationship that he has with his, estranged wife Holly. And then when he arrives at his her employers, Nakatomi Plaza for that Christmas party. He finds himself kind of unprepared, for this chaos that's about to unfold. So while he's washing, the grime of his, long flight off in the men's restroom, the the building is taken over by this group of these armed terrorists, led by Hans Gruber. And just this whole unexpected turn of events, leaves John McClane stranded, just kind of forced to navigate, that this towering skyscraper, alone, while he's fending off this group of these highly trained and these ruthless criminals. Um, and as the terrorists, execute their heist, they assume control of the building's communications, the security system, just all these employees and the guests, and just to making this clean escape nearly impossible. And John McClane, like I said, he was the only person in this building that has not become a hostage. He just uses his cunning, resourcefulness to avoid capture, and just begins his mission to dismantle this terrorist operation from the inside. And he takes to the buildings, floors are almost like a labyrinth. The building's almost like a labyrinth to him. Just and he's kind of engaging in all these series of just intense confrontations that really showcases the movie's kind of signature blend of action and wit and that suspense. And whether it's this, a brutal elevator battle, or, this, a rooftop standoff, or just this explosive showdown, in this kind of crowded corporate gala. John McClane's journey is this relentless string of this, high octane set pieces that keep the audience on the edge of their seats. And what makes Die Hard particularly captivating, I think, is the way that it balances, you know, explosive action with just a strong emotional core. The film's Christmas setting, adds this layer of heart to the proceedings. I think, as John McClane's determination to just ensure the safety of Holly, and his children and these hostages is deeply personal. It's a story of survival, and heroism, and just that resilience of the human spirit. I guess just these are elements that resonate. I think just as much as the film's iconic action sequences. Um, so, Die Hard, it left this indelible mark, on both, the action film genre and pop culture. It redefined what an action movie could be in the late 1980s. And, at a time when the genre was, dominated by these larger than life, muscular heroes like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. Die Hard introduced, a more vulnerable and realistically flawed hero in John McClane. Um, Bruce Willis's portrayal, of that everyman detective, just resonated with audiences in a way that really set this new standard for action stars. Blending that wit and determination, and just a distinct that working class charm, I guess you could say. This shift in tone and character, allowed for a more grounded and relatable action experience. And I think that's why so many people love this movie, because it paved the way for these future franchises that would adopt these similar themes and these types of characters. um, but beyond its impact just on the genre's conventions, um, Die Hard also sparked this wave of just imitations, and these inspired countless action films that would follow. Just the idea of this lone hero battling these overwhelming odds, within with a confined space, just really became the staple, of the action genre from there on out. Which is often referred to as like Die Hard on a blank type of setting, so and that was basically like so many action films that would follow. They would just base their plot around what the plot was for Die Hard. From Speed, where a bus is rigged with explosives, to later on, in the 2000s, the Resident Evil movies. Where with Mila Jovovich, where this corporation's underground facility turns into a death trap. The film's influence is still deeply embedded in so many modern action films. Its success also led directly to this franchise with four sequels. That would continue the story of John McClane in just different high stakes scenarios. Um, and although the sequels didn't reach that same level, of acclaim as the original, they definitely solidified Die Hard as this long running, culturally significant, franchise. And moreover, Die Hard's cultural impact, extends beyond the film industry. Its inclusion in just the National Film Registry, by the Library of Congress in 2017 as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. I think is what they phrase it as. It just highlights that enduring relevance. The film's themes of personal struggle and survival and just redemption remain powerful here, and just that with its iconic dialogue and these performances. Um, and Die Hard's influence just continues to shape, a lot of action storytelling, and just is a definitely a benchmark, for those high stakes, claustrophobic, thrillers out there. Um, but Die Hard has more than earned its place, I think, as a beloved classic among both action movie, fans and Christmas film lovers. Um, as someone who grew up celebrating both of these genres, I can attest that Die Hard holds a unique position, in that kind of cinematic landscape. It manages to deliver the thrills of a summer blockbuster while, fully embracing that spirit of the holiday season. And over the years, it has grown from just this commercial underdog into this cultural phenomenon. With its Christmas setting now regarded as this integral part of its charm. Um, so what was initially marketed as an action film has in the decade since its release become this essential holiday tradition for a lot of people, including myself. Um, where it plays on television, streaming services. They do anniversary showings in theaters for this. I mean, it's crazy. Like one of the reasons so many people have grown up loving Die Hard is just because it manages to balance intense action with just the emotional stakes of a holiday story. And John McClane's personal struggle to reconnect with his wife at a time when the outside world is experiencing one of the most important celebrations of the year. It really adds this layer of sentiment that just really makes the film more than just a sequence of shootouts and explosions, and it like I said, it's that story of survival, and resilience, and just that power of the individual to overcome these impossible odds, while staying true to what matters most. Um, and this emotional core, combined with the film's relentless pacing and just these iconic performances, has really made it a film that just resonates deeply with audiences of all ages. Um, and as a result, it has become a film that people return to year after year. Just rediscovering those thrills and that wit, with a new appreciation, um, just that grows with each viewing. And I can't help but to think whenever I think of Die Hard now, because I'm also a big fan of the TV show The Office. And in the later seasons of The Office, towards the end of the show's run, there was a character on there named Pete. and which they would also call him Plop. And there was a storyline going on the show at the time where he kind of had this crush on another character named Aaron, and he was basically just doing things to try to impress her. And then he was telling this story about him and his brother grew up loving the movie Die Hard, and they memorized every word of the movie. So, in a way to impress her, he starts like just kind of running off, um, with the dialogue, just repeating the whole dialogue of the film to her, and it's just I don't know what it is about that. It's so funny, but like it's funny to me because that reminds me of myself in a way because I've always had this thing to where when I fall in love with films, I can always remember tons and tons of the dialogue throughout the film. And when I first met Candace, I remember that was one of the things we really bonded over was just like different movies that we had that we loved that we had in common, and we were always just reciting different lines from movies that we loved, and we still do that to this day, like it's just in casual conversation. um so yeah, I mean that's just a little tidbit. It doesn't really mean anything, but it's but it means something to me, but it's just something I wanted to mention. And just like I said, that part with of the office, if you've never watched the office, I highly suggest watching the office if you never have. But yeah. But anyway, said Die Hard's influence, just on both the action and holiday film genres, has ensured that it remains as relevant today as it was in 1988. Its legacy is not only seen in those countless imitations, but just also in a way that has redefined what a Christmas movie can be. It's a film that reminds us that the best stories are the ones that combine heart with action, and it continues to inspire new generations of viewers. As I reflect on the countless times that I've watched this movie, as a child and now as an adult, I can confidently say that it will always be a film that I look forward to watching every single year. Um, it's just a perfect fusion of action and suspense and just that holiday tradition that will remain an essential part of that whole cinematic landscape for years to come. Um, and I see my good buddy, the creepy Kentuckian from Dead Pit, dropped in and says, "All them hand gestures, Bose. I think you are a presidential candidate." Well, I wouldn't go that far because I'm not a politics guy. But thanks for noticing. Um, but anyway, so let's move on from the holiday action film genre to the comedy holiday film. In this next film I want to talk about is just this irresistible, alchemy of comedy and heart and Christmas cheer, for Christmas movie lovers, and that's Scrooged from 1988. Scrooged is a rare treasure. It's a this modern retelling of A Christmas Carol that swaps Charles Dickens' 19th century London for a 1980s New York City that's steeped in like cynicism and corporate greed and that relentless hustle for money. Just basically for fans of Bill Murray, I think that this movie is the ultimate showcase of his genius. This is a film where his signature kind of sardonic humor and that vulnerability, converge to create this, this character who is both just a grump and he's grappling with this redemption. Um, and as a fan who grew up, adoring both Christmas movies and Bill Murray's, comedic brilliance, Scrooge, embodies the perfect collision of Christmas magic and that charm that that Bill Murray is so well known for. It's a film that defies convention, yet never forgets the heart of the story that it reimagines. So whether you're binging holiday classics or you're just rewatching this movie for the hundredth time or whatever, Scrooge definitely stands out as a cult favorite. I think, especially around this time of year, but just because it's just as funny, as it is sincerely moving. I think, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But this movie was directed by Richard Donner, who if you don't know Richard Donner, you really need to open yourself up to his work because Richard Donner not only did one of my favorite movies of all time, The Goonies, but he did Superman, Superman 2, the Lethal Weapon movies. Um, and just so many on the list. I mean, Richard Donner is just a amazing director. And here with Scrooge, he was also assisted by the writing brilliance from Mitch Glazer and Michael O'Donoghue, and they just brought together this satirical Christmas fantasy film that just reworks Charles Dickens's timeless tale of a Christmas Carol into this kind of neon drenched, fast-paced world of 1980s television. So Bill Murray, he stars as Frank Cross, and Frank is this jaded, TV executive whose soulless ambition leads to this whole supernatural intervention for him. And while the film retains that core structure of a Christmas Carol, like Frank is visited by these three ghosts on Christmas Eve, it amplifies the stakes with this modern absurdity and that dark humor and just a twist on these moral fables. um so the film's production history really adds to its allure as well. It was shot on this $32 million budget in New York City and Hollywood over 3 months, I think it was, and it was Bill Murray's first major role since Ghostbusters back in 1984, which I think has really cemented his status, as a comedy icon. Um, his decision to return for this movie, Scrooged, was definitely a gamble for him, I think. He had walked away from the project multiple times due to kind of these creative clashes with Richard Donner, and yet his performance, which is just laced with cynicism and warmth and this kind of this dash of self deprecation, really elevated this film into a timeless classic. The cast, ensemble aside from Bill Murray, including Karen Allen, John Forsythe, John Glover, Carol Kane, Bobcat Goldthwait, just to name a few, really adds layers, just of authenticity and humor to it. And this movie was marketed, as a Bill Murray Christmas film, with these ads, blending his Ghostbusters fame just with this new role as this grumpy executive, that's haunted by ghosts. And despite initial criticism from some reviewers out there who found it too mean spirited or slapstick heavy, this film definitely resonated with audiences. It grossed over $100 million worldwide, and like I said, today it's held as a cult Christmas classic. Just a blend of surrealism and sentimentality that feels both ahead of its time, and it's endlessly rewatchable, I think. And I see that the poet in here said that he saw Scrooge in the theater, and that's awesome, man. I wish I could have seen Scrooge in the theater. I didn't get to see it until we rented it on VHS because when I was a kid, for some reason, my parents didn't really like going to the theater much. So I mean, it was just every once in a blue moon we would go to the movie theater to watch something. So most of the time, I had to wait till stuff came out on VHS or whatever to watch it. But that's super cool, man, that you got to see it in the theater. I would love to see Scrooge in the theater. Um, but to talk about what this movie is really about, so Scrooge begins, with Frank Cross. Like I said, he's this ruthless, the youngest president in the history of the company of IBC Television, and he's just obsessed with creating this ratings guaranteed live broadcast of a Christmas Carol, and just his corporate ruthlessness, just where he fires his loyal assistant for questioning his ethics and alienating colleagues, which is with his toxic workaholic, type, personality that he has. It really sets the stage for just this kind of supernatural awakening that he has. So, um, on Christmas Eve, the ghost of Lou Hayward, um, was Frank's former boss, who had apparently died unloved, warns him of these three, impending ghostly visits, which, in connection to A Christmas Carol, they'll be like Jacob Marley coming to Ebenezer Scrooge. Um, so that journey in this film for Frank through the past and the present and the future is where the film really shines. Um, the Ghost of Christmas Past is played by David Johansen, who I think he just passed away earlier this year. But this was really my introduction to David Johansen was with this movie Scrooge, where he plays this chain smoking, taxi driver who transports Frank to these pivotal moments in his life. Just a like a lonely childhood, spent huddled around the TV and or this kind of romantic but work obsessed courtship that he had with Claire, who's played by Karen Allen, and in just what would eventually be this kind of gradual moral decay of his character, of his personality. Um, so when they move on to the next ghost, the ghost of Christmas Present, who's portrayed by Carol Kane, and she's probably um, my favorite ghost. In this film, because she's just this violent fairy like ghost, exposes Frank's, impacts on others, including his estranged brother and just, and these, these struggling employees that Frank has had to deal with. But, the most harrowing visit, though, I think, is from the Ghost of Christmas Future, which is this kind of grim, nihilistic specter who shows Frank, this future where he's reduced to ashes, at this morbid memorial. Um, and Frank's transformation beyond this is both hilarious and heartfelt. So after that, that climactic showdown with this disgruntled ex-employee, his assistant that he had fired earlier in the film, played by Bobcat Goldthwait, Frank embraces his redemption. He rehires his assistant. He takes over the live broadcast, and he delivers this tearful apology to Claire and and all of his loved ones, his coworkers, all these people that's employed under him, and it's just a absolutely amazing speech. I mean that the character gives in this part of the film, and it's so heartfelt and emotional that it always gets me teary eyed every time I watch it, and it really gets me kind of like choked up because it's and that just shows what an incredible actor that Bill Murray is as well because um I've heard not the greatest stories about Bill Murray in person. I've heard from some people say that he can be kind of an asshole. Um, so just to show how heartfelt he could be in that character's Frank at the end of this film, like I said, it shows how much of an incredible actor he is. So the film ends with the Frank and Karen and I was Karen, Frank and Claire, who's played by Karen Allen, and just the rest of the cast here, all singing "Oh Come All Ye Faithful," and also "Put a Little Love in Your Heart." So Frank finally, rediscovers his Christmas spirit, and I absolutely love this ending. Um, but when Scrooge premiered in 1988, critics, like I said earlier, they were polarized. Some dismissed it as too cynical or slapstick heavy, while there were others that just praised its bold reimagining of A Christmas Carol. But over time, I said the film's cult status has grown and it's now celebrated as, this Christmas classic, every year, that just and it that that dares to challenge these norms of holiday movies. And I'll tell you why Scrooge, remains relevant to this day. Um, So, it just because Scrooge at the time in the 1980s, it mirrored that kind of, materialist, excess, of the 1980s, with, Frank's obsession with ratings and profit serving as this kind of satirical, critique of America's commercialization, of Christmas. And today, as debates about consumer culture and, work life balance, persist, the film feels eerily relevant. Um, Frank's journey from, this money hungry, guy to just someone who embraces, empathy, resonates deeply in an era where that toxic hustle culture is being questioned. Um, but to talk more about Bill Murray's, performance here, he just has Bill Murray had this defiant originality about him, and his performance in this film is iconic. He plays Frank as a man who's, both the butt of the joke and the soul of the story. His wit, his timing, and just ability to, kind of oscillate between sarcasm and sincerity. It really makes Frank this very memorable anti-hero. The film marked a turning point in Bill Murray's career, proving that he could carry a major studio picture while staying true to his that eccentric comedy style that he always has. Um, and for fans, this Scrooge is a masterclass in how to reinvent, a classic tale with, a unique voice. Um, and it it rejects that warm and fuzzy, formula of traditional holiday films. Instead, it leans into that black comedy, the dark comedy, surrealism, and even horror. Really, if you think of the scene with Michael J. Pollard's character, who's he finds his frozen corpse down in this utility tunnel. Um, and even, the Ghost of Christmas Future. I mean, the Grim Reaper looking like ghost with opens up and you it looks like the body of souls from Nightmare on Elm Street, and he has almost like this kind of analog like screen for a face. It's very strange and really cool looking. I love it. Um, but this the refusal to play it safe with Scrooge, has inspired modern, Christmas movies like Office Christmas Party from 2018. I don't know if you guys have seen that one, but films like that really just embrace, absurdity and irreverence. Just and if you think about Netflix and these cable channels that air Scrooged annually now. It's a regular, on these best Christmas movies lists. Its enduring appeal really lies in its balance of, humor and heart, with these, iconic moments like Frank's, live broadcast apology that he gives, and just that rendition of "Put a Little Love in Your Heart." The film's embrace of chaos, like the ghostly antics and the that elevator showdown. It really makes it this kind of perfect, counterpoint just to the more wholesome, Christmas Carol adaptations. Um, but ultimately, Scrooged is a story about second chances. It reminds viewers that change is never too late. You know, even if the path to redemption is kind of fraught with these, you know, self-inflicted chaos. Um, for Bill Murray fans, this I think is a recurring theme, in his filmography. In Ghostbusters, Peter Venkman grapples with this kind of, um, this this he kind of grapples with, like, what's real and what's not, and that kind of existential dread. While in the film Lost in Translation, it explores, loneliness and connection. And I think Scrooged, adds another layer to Bill Murray's legacy, where, he's a comedian who can deliver laughs while kind of probing that human condition, if you know what I mean. But in conclusion, Scrooge is a must see for anyone who loves Christmas and or comedy or Bill Murray. It's more than that modern, Christmas Carol retelling. It's a love letter just to the spirit of Christmas, wrapped in this kind of Bill Murray package, through chaos and just redemption. And for fans of the holidays, for fans of Christmas, it's a heartfelt reminder that Christmas is about more than tinsel and carols. It's about reconnecting with others and oneself. Um, and that's definitely relatable for a lot of people. And just for Bill Murray fans, you know, it's a masterclass in just comedic and dramatic versatility. With this role as Frank Cross that feels as though it was written just for him. And decades after its release, Scrooge continues to capture the essence of what makes Christmas movies endure. And that's a mix of humor and heart and hope. Its cult status is well earned, and its place in that world of holiday classics is definitely secure. So, as the ghosts of Christmas past, present, future would say, Scrooge is a film that reminds us to be kind, be thankful, be yourself. Even if you're playing this grumpy executive in a surreal Christmas comedy. So definitely, sit down with the family, with friends, whoever, and let this movie, and its magical chaos just warm your heart, this Christmas season. If you haven't watched this movie in a while, if you haven't watched this movie ever, definitely take the time. This is not one you want to pass up, especially for if you're looking for movies around the Christmas season. After all, I mean, as Frank Cross learns, it's never too late to rediscover joy. And Bill Murray's genius is the perfect guide here for that. So definitely check out Scrooged. Watch it again if you've already seen it. I love that movie. But speaking of loving movies around the Christmas holiday, and then this next one is not just one that I love, but this is probably one of the most beloved Christmas movies ever made. I know that me and my side of the family love this movie. I love this movie since I was a kid. Uh, my wife Candace and her side, her family, absolutely. I mean, they love this movie. And my father-in-law Carl, who passed away a couple of years ago, this was one of his absolute favorite movies to watch around this time of year. But he would watch this movie actually like several times throughout the year. He loved it so much. It might have been one of his favorite movies actually. Um, and that's National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation from 1989. And this movie stands, like I said, as one of the most beloved and enduring Christmas films. Cherished by fans of the holiday season and just comedy alike. And it was directed by Jeremiah Chechik, I think is how you say his name. Some of these directors, man, their names are hard to pronounce. But anyway, and it was written by the legendary John Hughes. So this film, it builds on that slapstick humor, and that chaotic charm, of the Vacation franchise, and it offers this delightfully absurd take on just the pursuit of the perfect Christmas. Um, and this is the third installment in the series of the Vacation franchise. And I actually reviewed the first Vacation movie earlier this year. It was like one of the first like 30 or 40 movies that I watched this year. So if you want to hear my review on that, you can go watch that back on the channel. But like I said, this is the third installment in the Vacation series, and it maintains that unique blend of humor and heart that fans have come to expect, while also introducing these new layers of holiday nostalgia and that family bonding. You know, and for those who have grown up with the Griswold family, and I know there's millions of people out there that did, this film is not just a movie. It's a tradition. Um, its ability to seamlessly mix those slapstick antics with with heartfelt moments really makes it a standout in that kind of crowded Christmas movie landscape. um the film's appeal is further enhanced just by that iconic presence, of Chevy Chase in his role as Clark Griswold, who's has this over the top enthusiasm, for the holiday, and it never fails to entertain. Um, just his comedic timing, you know, just the same as like Bill Murray has with his comedic timing in Scrooge, is just and that timing that Chevy Chase has combined with the film's, you know, cleverly constructed set, in these set pieces, just ensures that Christmas Vacation, remains just a source of laughter year after year. And what began as this received box office hit has just since evolved into this cultural touchstone. It's frequently cited as one of the best holiday comedies of all time. Whether it's the chaotic tree cutting scenes, or the over the top Christmas decorations of the millions of lights that he has put up on the house, this film is a must watch. It's just that its lasting popularity is a testament, to its ability to deliver, both humor and heart. Just making it this timelessly, entertaining film for fans of the Vacation franchise and just anyone who loves a good Christmas story. Um, so this movie, like I said, was sort of the third installment in the Vacation series, which is this collection of films. It's based on that short story Vacation '58 by John Hughes, and but this particular entry, however, was inspired by John Hughes's short story Christmas '59, which was originally published, in National Lampoon magazine before being adapted, for the big screen. Um, the film blends that slapstick comedy with this wacky holiday antics, really making it a standout in both, the Vacation series and just the broader universe of Christmas films. But unlike the previous two films, which Vacation and European Vacation, which focused on these summer road trips. Christmas Vacation shifts to the winter months, exploring just the chaos that ensues when Clark Griswold attempts to create the perfect Christmas. Um, and Chevy Chase, as like I said, who reprised his iconic role here as Clark Griswold, who is just and Clark is that well-meaning, but just endlessly enthusiastic father whose holiday plans spiral in just a comedic disaster. As with the previous films, Christmas Vacation retains that signature mix of just family-friendly humor and these absurd situations, all while staying true to that spirit, of the Vacation franchise. Um, and like I said, the screenplay was written by John Hughes, and this was his only Christmas themed film. And it showcased well that he had written. That is, I mean, because of course he did produce Home Alone, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. But his only Christmas theme film that he had written, it showcases his unique ability, to balance heartfelt family moments with these kind of hilarious misadventures. Um, the film was produced by Hughes Entertainment. It was released by Warner Brothers. It hit theaters on December 1st, 1989. And I was like 3 years old at the time when this movie was released. But notably, this was the final Vacation film to involve John Hughes and National Lampoon, and which really made it this pivotal chapter, in the franchise's history. And despite initial mixed reviews from critics, Christmas Vacation has since grown in popularity, as like I said, is now regarded as one of excuse me as one of the greatest holiday comedies of all time. So it was filmed in Summit County, Colorado, and Burbank, California, and just the movie's kind of picturesque winter setting, really adds to its charm. Just with and it had a production budget of $25 million, and it went on to gross over $73 million, at the box office, proving that commercial success. However, it wasn't just the film's comedic appeal that cemented its place in pop culture. Its ability just to capture the joys and the frustrations of the holiday season that I know about all too well. It just really made it a perennial favorite and a relatable favorite. I think that's why Christmas Vacation, I think, remains a must watch for fans of holiday movies and comedy and just the vacation franchise. It's a timelessly entertaining film that never fails to deliver, and it definitely delivers on laughs and these heartwarming moments, in that equal kind of measure. Um, so to talk more about like what happens in the film, the Griswold family's holiday plans begin with this seemingly simple goal, to have that best Christmas possible. Well, it's not really the Griswold family's plan, it's Clark's plans. But Clark, I guess that well-meaning, yet overzealous, father figure of the family is well, father figure. He's the father of the family, is determined to outdo every other family, in the neighborhood, with his Christmas decorations and his traditions, and the film's chaotic humor is introduced early on when Clark, armed with this ladder and a saw, he takes his family out to these snowy woods to find the perfect Griswold family Christmas tree. And however, in this kind of typical Griswold mishap, they realize that they forgot the necessary tools for cutting it down. So rather than just admit defeat, Clark insists on uprooting the tree by hand, leading to this hilariously, this hilarious struggle that just results in a this mangled tree and back home. Clark's plans kind of quickly spiral out of control. He decides that the neighborhood needs a dazzling display of these Christmas lights. And, after a series of these failed attempts to string them up, he finally succeeds, only to cause this citywide blackout when the lights overwhelm the whole electrical grid of the city. Meanwhile, Clark's in-laws, both whom have very distinct personalities and just this endless ability to cause trouble, arrive for the holiday. It sets the stage for this series of just escalating conflicts. The chaos deepens when Clark's eccentric Aunt Bethany and Uncle Lewis show up, along with Ellen's cousin Catherine, and her rough around the edges husband Eddie. They show up unannounced, each bringing their own brand of that kind of holiday mayhem. Um, and as the holiday progresses, Clark's relentless, optimism clashes with reality. Particularly when his boss, Frank Shirley, fails to deliver the promised Christmas bonus, leaving Clark financially strapped. Instead, he gives him like a year long subscription to the Jelly of the Month Club. And as Eddie says, that's the gift that keeps on giving, Clark. Uh, but the Griswolds just endure a disastrous Christmas Eve dinner. And then Aunt Bethany's cat gets electrocuted, and the tree gets burned up. And just Clark's frustration is just building and building. It boils over, in this legendary explosive rant, that the film is so well known for. But however, the film's heart shines through as Clark, eventually learns that the true spirit of Christmas isn't in perfection, but just in the love and togetherness of his family. Um, this realization is emphasized in the film's ending when the Griswold household ends up in a full blown like Christmas explosion outside of the house. Yet the family's bond remains strong, and through all the chaos and the comedic disasters, Christmas Vacation masterfully blends humor with just holiday warmth and just making this beloved holiday classic. Um, and I think one of the most unforgettable scenes in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation is the tree cutting mishap with Clark. Just with his signature enthusiasm, he attempts to just cut that perfect tree in the snowy forest. Only to realize that the family forgot to bring the saw. Um, so like I mentioned that earlier, but I think that's one of the best like scenes in the entire. It's at the beginning of the movie. So with that, you already know you're in for such a great movie when the opening is one of the most unforgettable scenes of the film. Um, and I think that whole sequence just perfectly encapsulates that the film's blend of slapstick humor and absurdity, and as Clark and his family just become hopelessly entangled with this tree and this chaotic struggle that just that ends with the front of the car completely covered in snow and pine needles and all that. But another iconic moment is the Griswold house's Christmas lighting display, which initially seems like a humble holiday decoration, but soon kind of escalates into this absurd spectacle of things. Despite multiple failed attempts, Clark finally gets the lights to work, and only because he it causes all the lights in the neighborhood to go out. This citywide blackout. I just think that this kind of exaggeration of Clark's over the top holiday spirit, perfectly captures that film's comedic tone and just turning this simple simple tradition to this elaborate yet comically unnecessary endeavor. Um, and then there's just of course one of the scenes that this film is so well known for. I mean, there's merchandise of this scene, and just so many things out there with cousin Eddie when he's unloading the waste from his RV, and just people are looking on. He's like, shitter was full. So I actually have a friend who just went to a convention uh, a while back and got to meet Randy Quaid, who plays Cousin Eddie. And my friend dressed up as Cousin Eddie from Christmas Vacation in like the winter hat and the bathrobe and everything. It looked fantastic. But I think the sewer explosion at the end of the film, though, perhaps is the film's one of the film's most legendary scenes. As Clark and his family, head outside for that one final chaotic moment. Uncle Lewis tosses that lit match into the drain, causes this massive explosion that sets the neighborhood's Christmas decorations on fire, and you see this flaming like Santa's sleigh, flying into the sky, and it's and then you have Aunt Bethany, singing the Star Spangled Banner. I think it's just a masterclass in just physical comedy and that holiday absurdity. Um, but since its release in 1989, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation has become a staple of just holiday entertainment. Consistently ranking among the most beloved Christmas movies of all time. And I think this widespread, cultural impact is evident in just the countless parodies and references and just the quotable lines, that have permeated mainstream media out there everywhere. Every year the film is re-aired on television networks and streaming platforms, and like I said, this is another one of those films, just like Scrooged, Die Hard, and other Christmas movies out there. Even my favorite of all time, Gremlins. They are put out there in theater screenings for just these kind of special holiday screenings, and just proven that its appeal has only grown with time. And I've seen in the past few years, Chevy Chase has actually been making appearances, and like they'll show the movie, and then he'll do like a Q&A with the crowd on stage and stuff. So I think that's super cool. And and I think for many, it has become as much a part of the season, as eggnog and carols or whatever. With families just gathering to watch Clark get Clark Griswold's chaotic holiday antics. And I know that's something that I have done since I was a kid with my family. Candace has done with her family. Me and Candace's dad, we used to sit and watch Christmas Vacation all the time every year, in the time that he was with us. And just it this movie really helps create a lot of good memories, for me personally. And it just further, shows that, the film's success played a crucial role in solidifying the vacation franchise's, legacy. Just further endearing the Griswold family to audiences everywhere. And John Hughes's influence, is just undeniable, as that his signature blend of comedy and that heartfelt storytelling found this perfect home, in the holiday genre. Just the film's ability, to balance that slapstick humor with just genuine, family bonding really helped set the standard for Christmas comedies everywhere. And it would influence countless future productions that strive, for that kind of similar mix of laughter and just those heartwarming moments. Chevy Chase's performance as Clark Griswold remains as one of the most iconic in holiday movies, in holiday movie history. That over the top and enthusiasm, just combined with his character's relentless optimism, makes Christmas Vacation this timeless celebration, of the spirit of Christmas in all its chaotic yet utterly endearing glory. Um, whether it's, the legendary tree cutting scene or the explosive, culminating moment with the flaming Santa sleigh, the film never fails to deliver both humor and heart, and it makes it a deservedly, enduring holiday classic. It's a film that manages to be both wildly entertaining and deeply heartwarming. It's just a rare combination, that has really earned its place as a holiday favorite for decades. So whether you're a lifelong fan, of the Vacation franchise, or just simply looking for a comedic yet meaningful Christmas movie, this film delivers on every level. Um, the Griswold family's, over the top holiday endeavors are as chaotic as ever. But what makes the film truly special is how it manages to inject that genuine heart into the holiday season. Um, Despite just the constant misadventures and the all the slapstick chaos, the the film ultimately reinforces that importance of family, that joy of togetherness, and just that finding that spirit of the season in, these most unexpected moments. Um, so for anyone who enjoys, laughter and family and just, the magic of Christmas, this is one movie that simply cannot be missed. It's just, for fans of the Vacation series, this film is a perfect continuation of the Griswolds' brand of humor, while also proving, that their adventures can be as heartwarming as they are hilarious. So definitely go watch Christmas Vacation this year. It's one that's on my list every single year. If you've not watched this movie, where have you been? What rock have you been hiding under? Because this is a movie that you should watch at least once at some point in your life. Um, but before I move on to the next film, and because this next film is, not only one of my favorites to watch around Christmas, um, but it's just one of those movies I really love to watch any time of the year. And it's probably my favorite when it comes to Tim Burton's films. Um, Give me just a second here. But Edward Scissorhands, there are a few films that capture the spirit of both Christmas and those gothic fantasy, films, quite like Edward Scissorhands from 1990. Um, this is a Tim Burton masterpiece. Like I said, this is probably, that's really hard to determine too because I love Beetlejuice. Um, I love Tim Burton's Batman, but and amongst other things that Tim Burton's worked on, but this is definitely probably my favorite when it comes to Tim Burton's films. And to me, this film is far more than just a mere holiday movie. It's a deeply touching exploration of love and alienation and just self discovery. It's all wrapped in the director's signature visual style that Tim Burton is known and loved for. Um, from a Christmas movie fan's perspective, the film's romantic and whimsical tone combined with just the wintertime setting makes it this beloved addition, to the holiday universe of films. Um, and for a long time admirer, of Tim Burton's work, this movie represents something even more profound. Which I feel it's his most personal and endearing work. Just it's bursting with that eccentric charm, and that melancholy atmosphere that just define Burton's filmmaking. Um, Edward Scissorhands remains this masterpiece that resonates decades after its release. And as a fan of Tim Burton's, just that allure of that allure of Edward Scissorhands really lies in the way it encapsulates the director's unique artistic vision. Tim Burton has always had this knack for portraying outsiders and misfits, characters who feel disconnected from the world yet remain hopeful in their search for belonging. And Johnny Depp and his breakout role as Edward, embodies this perfectly. He brings this sense of innocence and vulnerability and charm to the screen here. And the film also features some of Tim Burton's most cherished collaborators, including Winona Ryder, who was also in Beetlejuice as Lydia. In this, she plays Kim as Edward's love interest. And then you have my favorite guy in horror of all time, Vincent Price, who plays the inventor, the man that invented Edward. And this is one of his final roles. Um, but I also, when it comes to Tim Burton, I have to always mention Danny Elfman as well, because Danny Elfman's enchanting score, here really adds that haunting yet tender quality to the film, and it really elevates that emotional depth, in a way that few composers could. Um, for someone who has grown up, admiring all these names that I've mentioned, Edward Scissorhands is not just a movie. It is a celebration of just of these people that worked on this film's combined genius and just this enduring, ode to the quiet beauty of outcasts and dreamers. And Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands was born from a deeply personal place from Tim Burton. It was so it's shaped by his own experiences of isolation and artistic expression. As a teenager, um, Tim Burton, he grew up in suburban Burbank, California. Um, and he just felt profoundly alienated by that kind of cookie cutter world around him. And some of his early sketches, which would later serve as a foundation for the film, depicted this pale, solemn man with these sharply long fingers that were like scissors or knives. Which is reminiscent of the Edward Scissorhands character that we now know. These early drawings were more than just artistic musings. They were these direct reflections of Tim Burton's own sense of disconnection, and just his yearning to express, these emotions that were, rarely articulated around him. Um, just and the development of Edward Scissorhands took shape, during the early stages of Tim Burton's career, particularly during the pre-production of Beetlejuice. Um, so he was seeking to craft this new project that really mirrored his unique vision. And he collaborated with this novelist, Carolyn Thompson, to to adapt this character into a screenplay. And Thompson's work on her short novel Firstborn, which is a story about an abortion that reanimates, it resonated with Tim Burton. It's because it explored that psychological complexities of life and creation, which were themes that are central to Edward Scissorhands. Um, so with these inspirations in mind, um, you know Thompson crafted this screenplay that was both a love letter to Tim Burton and a deeply personal narrative. And she would later note, every detail was so important to Tim because it was so personal, and that really highlighted the intimacy with which the film was developed. Um, and despite these initial hesitations from Warner Brothers, Edward Scissorhands eventually, found a home at 20th Century Fox with, Tim Burton's, rising success following Batman, from just the year before. So this film marked the fourth collaboration with Danny Elfman, which was a partnership that was integral to the film's kind of emotional core. Um, so the combination of Tim Burton's distinct visual style and Thompson's poignant storytelling and Danny Elfman's enchanting score really laid the foundation for a film that would become, a timeless tale of love and identity and just acceptance. And this kind of collaborative spirit, which was born from Tim Burton's personal history and just the creative synergy of his team, would ultimately define the film as this unique and just deeply affecting piece of cinema. Um, and I think one of the most remarkable aspects of Edward Scissorhands is just the extraordinary cast that just brought this, eccentric character of Edward and that surreal world of of suburban America to life. And at the heart of the film, like I said, is Johnny Depp's portrayal of Edward, just which is a role that would become one of the defining performances, of his career. He just embodied Edward with just this kind of unsettling yet endearing blend of just innocence and curiosity and just that quiet sadness. His portrayal of this man with these scissor blades for hands speak and it speaks he speaks in these muffled tones and just approaches the world with like this kind of childlike wonder. It's definitely both haunting and just profoundly moving. um the physical transformation that Johnny Depp, underwent for the role, um, donning this, prosthetic, mask with the scars and the fake hands and the this exaggerated posture, it didn't overpower his performance. Instead, it amplified the character's emotional depth. And Edward's vulnerability and sincerity were evident in every action, making this compelling outsider, struggling to find acceptance in a world that sees him as this oddity. Um, and I think equally essential to the film's emotional impact is Winona Ryder's performance as Kim, which is Edward's love interest, and um, as this young actress with just a growing reputation for playing these enigmatic and emotionally complex characters, such as Lydia and Beetlejuice, and she's in Heathers, and she was in Mermaids with Cher. She really brought this delicate sensitivity to Kim and complemented Johnny Depp's portrayal perfectly. Um, and just their on-screen chemistry was subtle yet powerful. Just grounded in these shared glances and unspoken yearning rather than these grand gestures. Kim, who is this teenager, is caught between that superficiality of suburban life and just her growing desire just to connect with something more profound. Um, Found in Edward a mirror of her own sense of isolation. And Winona Ryder's portrayal allowed audiences to see both Kim's fascination with Edward and just that internal conflict she faced in choosing between this societal conformity and genuine love. um, the dynamic between Johnny Depp and Vincent Price also deserves particular attention. In one of his final film roles, Vincent Price brought this kind of touch of melancholy to the character of Edward's reclusive inventor. Um, his presence added this sense of history and melancholy to the story and emphasized that tragic nature of Edward's existence. Um, Vincent Price's subtle, mournful delivery of his scenes, with Edward was instrumental in illustrating just that deep bond between these two characters, and just it reinforced, the idea that Edward's journey of acceptance was not only a personal struggle, but also this testament just to the love of his creator. Um, and then, supporting the core cast was this ensemble of actors who provided just a vivid contrast, to Edward's world. Diane West's character Peg Boggs, offers this warmth and kindness to Edward. She's the one that goes and gets him in the first place. Just it just reinforces the film's central themes of compassion and understanding. And Danny Elfman's score, will heighten the emotional tone of each scene, blending this kind of whimsy with melancholy to create this atmosphere that just that captured the duality of Edward's existence, which is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Um, and just in the hands of these actors and musicians, Edward Scissorhands became this poignant and just unforgettable exploration of love and identity and just a search for belonging. And just to talk about this tale of longing and belonging, the story of Edward Scissorhands, just like I said, is that exploration of love and alienation and just that desire for acceptance. Um, so in the story, Edward is this unfinished creation with these scissor blades for hands, and he's trapped in this attic of this decaying Victorian mansion. So when the Avon sales lady, Peg Boggs, played by Diane West, you know, this discovers him, she brings him into this warmth, of her suburban home, where he's introduced to this world full of just new experiences and this human connection that he never knew. Um, it is in this kind of setting that that Edward encounters Kim, played by Winona Ryder, whose beauty and kindness kind of stir this deep affection within him. And just their growing bond forms the emotional core of the film. Yet, it is inherently tragic. Edward is a man of great grace and sensitivity, yet his very existence marks him as this outsider. Um, Tim Burton's storytelling is just deeply rooted in the themes of, outsider experience and just that unrequited love. Um, Edward, despite his noble demeanor and that gentle nature, is just endlessly fascinated by the people around him and just is desperately yearning to belong. Um, However, his physical difference makes him this object of curiosity, at best, and fear at worst. His scissor hands, while allow him to perform these intricate tasks like hedge trimming and cutting people's hair, it ultimately becomes this barrier to the intimacy that he is longing for. Um, the film's most poignant moments, arise from Edward's inability to express his love through physical touch, um, which is, a fact emphasized in the film's, emotional climax when he must create this, intricate, eye sculpture in the shape of Kim at Christmas. The falling snow kind of created from just the shavings of the sculpture is this symbol of, his yearning to be close to her. Yet it also serves as this reminder of their incompatibility. Um, but beyond the romantic elements, Edward Scissorhands also serves as a subtle critique of suburban life. So the pastel colored houses and the 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 groomed lawns, the suburban neighborhood are, as portrayed by Tim Burton, are not inherently wrong, but are just painted with this kind of sense of artificiality and being rigid. The inhabitants of the neighborhood, begin to admire Edward, just drawn to his uniqueness, and their admiration is short lived though when he is misunderstood and he's ostracized, and just this this underlining critique of the societal conformity and fear of the unknown really adds this layer of depth to the narrative, and just reinforces the idea that true acceptance is not always based on understanding, but just on the willingness to see beyond appearances. um and Tim Burton's, signature, gothic sensibilities are just evident throughout the film, from the score by Danny Elfman to the stark contrast between Edward's dark, Victorian mansion and this bright and cheerful suburban world. And one of the things I want to mention about that is this movie kind of exists in its own world and it's in its own time, because with if you had the Victorian mansion, then you have like the pastel colored houses and just the style of the vehicles in the film, and there's some of the like electronics and stuff that's also featured in the film, and some of the other vehicles as well, like Jim's van. It doesn't exist in one time period. I mean, like I said, you had the Victorian mansion that Edward stayed in, and then like the neighborhood feels like this you're in like the '60s, but with the all of the other things in the film like the the clothing styles and Jim's van and the mention of like VCRs and all that. So it's kind of a mixture of this whole like Victorian period and the '60s and the '80s. So it doesn't. There's really no one like time setting in this film, and I love that. Like it kind of exists in its own world. But the gothic aesthetic of it, just combined with that fairy tale structure, of the story. Um, which is bookended by this elderly Kim recounting the events to her granddaughter. It highlights that timelessness of Edward's journey. He's a character caught between these two worlds, forever longing for love but unable to fully inhabit the world of his admirers. um, and in this way, Edward Scissorhands, really transcends, its genre, become this deeply moving meditation on identity and belonging and just that bittersweet nature of love. Excuse me. But, Edward Scissorhands has had this profound and lasting impact on pop culture. Just the film's unique blend of gothic romanticism, suburban satire and just that melancholic beauty has really influenced countless filmmakers and artists, in the decades that followed. Um, just his Tim Burton's signature visual style, which blends that fantasy and reality in a whimsical yet eerie manner, has become even more recognizable through this film. Its legacy is evident, in that the countless homages and parodies that have, emerged in pop culture. Like there's a parody um, uh, skit in a cartoon from the '90s I used to watch called Animaniacs, where they parody Edward Scissorhands, and then there's Frankenweenie, which is a feature length homage, to Tim Burton's earlier work. And then there's like various, television and just fashion references that really borrow from the aesthetic of this film. The design of Edward himself, with his pale complexion, just the exaggerated facial features, and just the Caesar like hands has really just become this iconic image, frequently reappearing in Halloween costumes and fan art and toys and fashion trends. I mean, you name it. And like I said, I've said this in the past that I'm really heavily into like the gothic aesthetic and goth culture, and just have been for many years. And I think a lot of it has to do, my beginnings with that has to do with Tim Burton and this movie, and not just this movie, but all of Tim Burton's work, and that's why I've come to love him so much over the years. Um, and Moreover, the film's influence extends beyond, visual aesthetics. Its themes of just outsider identity and longing for acceptance just continues to resonate with audiences. Particularly those who feel misunderstood or have felt misunderstood at some point in their life, or you just feel like you're out of place in a world that that prizes conformity. That dynamic between Edward and Kim, as well as, Edward's struggle to fit into society, has just become this powerful symbol, of that unrequited love and of just self-discovery. So its legacy, therefore, is not only, in its artistic achievements, but uh, but also, just in that emotional impact that it has had on fans and just so many people in the world who see themselves, reflected in this kind of tragic yet beautiful story of love and acceptance. So, it remains a cultural touchstone just for its unique blend, of the gothic romance and suburban satire and just that melancholic beauty. Decades after its release, the film continues just to enchant audiences with its visually stunning storytelling and just that emotionally resonant, narrative. Um, it just, Edward's journey is one that many can relate to. His struggle to fit into a world that finds him both fascinating and terrifying is just a universal experience that continues to resonate. Um, so for fans of Tim Burton's eccentric aesthetic and just darkly romantic storytelling, Edward Scissorhands is a masterclass in um, visual emotional depth. The that haunting score by Danny Elfman, Johnny Depp's unforgettable portrayal of the character, Vincent Price's final role as Edward's inventor, all contribute to this cinematic experience that is just both beautiful and bittersweet. Um, the film's themes of just otherness and unrequited love, just combined with that signature style that Tim Burton's known for, have just really made it this enduring piece of art, that just continues to inspire, new generations of fans, year after year. Um, so, it's that it's just this timeless story, that just resonates far beyond the Christmas season. And as a fan of Tim Burton's work, Edward Scissorhands I think remains one of the most personal films for me, in his repertoire. I think it's just a testament, just to the power of storytelling uh, and just artistry and just that that enduring charm, of a misunderstood hero. Um, so if you've never seen Edward Scissorhands, if you haven't seen it in a long time, definitely go and see it and see if it inspires you because it definitely did me. Um, Now that brings me to the last two films that we'll be talking about for tonight. And these are possibly considered the most popular Christmas movies of all time. Um, and I wanted to talk about both of these movies. I don't typically do this, but I want to talk about both of these movies and kind of, compare them amongst one another because even though these are two separate movies, it's a continuing story, much like how the Back to the Future movies are, or in some other film series. Um, and it's hard for me to kind of. It's always been hard for me to kind of choose a favorite between these two because I love them pretty much equally amongst one another. Um, and this is Home Alone and Home Alone 2. And from the moment that Home Alone hit theaters in 1990, it became this instant classic and arguably the most beloved Christmas film of all time. Definitely the most popular, I think. It's remarkable success. Not only launched Macaulay Culkin into stardom, but also set this new standard, for holiday entertainment, blending humor and heart, and just thrilling action in a way that resonates with audiences, of all ages. And two that two 2 years later, the 1992 sequel, Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, continued that story of Kevin McAllister, offering this fresh take on the original formula while maintaining the charm and the excitement that made the first film so unforgettable. And together, these two films form one of the most iconic and well loved Christmas movie duos. Um, with their mix of just slapstick comedy and just endearing characters and just that holiday themed adventure and ensuring that their place in cinematic history. And as a Christmas movie fanatic, and just a admirer of Macaulay Culkin and Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern, Catherine O'Hara, amongst other people in the films, it's impossible not to marvel at how these films have stood the test of time. Culkin's portrayal of Kevin McAllister is a masterclass in child performance. Showcasing both the mischievous energy and that the deep emotional intelligence of a young boy left alone during the holidays. Meanwhile, Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern deliver some of the most unforgettable comedic performances in film history. As this bumbling yet menacing wet bandits, Harry and Marv. And their over the top antics and just the signature catchphrases become iconic in the process. And the combination of Macaulay Culkin's charm and that hilarity of Pesci and Stern's dynamic creates this perfect balance of humor and just this heartwarming storytelling, making the Home Alone films essential holiday viewing. I mean, it's you cannot absolutely cannot go through the holiday season, the Christmas season without watching Home Alone and Home Alone 2. You just can't. But today I'm going to talk about and explore, both Home Alone from 1990 and Home Alone 2, Lost in New York from 1992. Just analyzing them, giving these production details, just most some of my most memorable moments from these films. as festive entertainment, these movies continue to bring joy and laughter every Christmas season, and just their lasting legacy is absolutely a testament to their brilliance as both holiday classics and these cinematic achievements. Um, so Home Alone from 1990, the first film, is absolute Christmas comedy classic. It was directed by Chris Columbus. It was written and produced by John Hughes, and Home Alone is a 1990 American Christmas comedy film that just marked both a significant departure and an evolution in John Hughes' storytelling. He was known for his ability to capture the complexities of just youth and these kind of family dynamics. John Hughes crafted Home Alone as this family friendly comedy with a unique twist. Um, and the story centers on Kevin McAllister, played by Macaulay Culkin, who is this mischievous, kind of over the top 8-year old who was left behind, by his family after this Christmas vacation mishap. And while John Hughes had previously worked on films like, The Breakfast Club and Back to the Future, and even one we just talked about earlier, Christmas Vacation, Home Alone, you know, showcased his affinity for lighthearted yet emotionally resonant narratives, just making it this fitting addition to his body of work. And originally, this was originally intended to be produced and distributed by Warner Brothers. Um, the film faced production challenges due to budget overruns and studio resistance. And it prompted this project to be moved to 20th Century Fox. And this shift, I think, proved instrumental in the film's eventual success. As it allowed John Hughes to retain more creative control. Um, and Macaulay Culkin was cast as Kevin after this huge audition process with just his natural charisma and that wide eyed innocence, making him this instant fit for the role. Um, the film also, featured, this stellar supporting cast, including Joe Pesci, and Daniel Stern as Harry and Marv. Catherine O'Hara is playing Kevin's mom, and um, John Hurt is Kevin's dad, and he's um, so many great actors and great cast for this film. Um, And Harry and Marv, played by Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern, you know, they would become indispensable, to the film's enduring charm. So this was shot, in and around Chicago, and Home Alone, utilized these real world locations to kind of enhance its, relatable suburban holiday atmosphere. Um, the film's 1990 release coincided with the holiday season, of course, and just its initial mixed to positive critical reception did little to dampen its appeal. Audiences were captivated by its unique premise. Just this child fending off these burglars, which is an idea that proved remarkably fresh for the genre. Um, and the film grossed an astonishing $476.7 million worldwide, becoming the second highest grossing film of that year, and it's the highest grossing live action comedy for 2 decades. I mean, this movie, upon its release, was number one at the box office for 12 weeks. I mean, that's insane, man. Like, especially for that time. I mean, I know that's kind of believable nowadays. With you look at like the Marvel movies and stuff like that. Um, but this was 1990, man. I mean, and moreover, it earned 2 Academy Award nominations and two Golden Globe nods. Cementing its status as a cinematic achievement. Um, excuse me. But beyond, that box office success, Home Alone left a profound
cultural impact. It introduced a new generation just to the joys, of family friendly comedy while, redefining the Christmas film genre. The film's success not only launched Culkin's career as a child star, but also established 20th Century Fox as this formidable force, in holiday themed cinema. And even decades later, Home Alone remains, a staple of Christmas viewing. Its classic moments and just unforgettable performances, ensuring its place you know, in film history. Um, so Home Alone, it opens with this chaotic preparation for the McAllister family's Christmas vacation in Paris. And as the family, gets ready to leave their suburban Chicago home, Kevin finds himself at the center, of this family dispute. So after a scuffle with his older brother Buzz at the night before they were going to leave, over Buzz eating all of the cheese pizza, Kevin is punished by being sent to sleep in the attic. And in this, moment of frustration, he wishes aloud for his family to disappear. Um, I made my family disappear. It's a wish that almost inexplicably comes true. Um, a storm causes this power outage overnight, and it sets off this chain of events. It just keeps the entire family, asleep while they should be leaving for the airport. And in all this confusion, Kevin is accidentally left behind, because when one of the the older girl of the family, she's counting heads of all the kids that are outside. She, accidentally counts like one of the neighbor kids that just came by to kind of aggravate these van drivers and stuff, for just a moment, and she counts him as being Kevin. So that, when Kevin actually awakens to find that the house is completely empty, the initial joy of his newfound, solitude quickly turns into this unease when, he encounters, this his neighbor, Old Man Marley, who, Buzz, you know, told this story early in the film, that this Old Man Marley is rumored to be this dangerous serial killer, and he keeps all the bodies in this trash can or whatever. Um, but as Kevin starts to settle into his unexpected alone time, the McAllister home becomes this target of these two burglars, Harry and Marv. And they're these members of this gang or duo, just because it's just them, known as the Wet Bandits. So this duo, having already targeted other suburban homes, during their Christmas heist, is they plan to rob the McAllister's house, believing it to be unoccupied. Because Harry actually shows up at the beginning of the film dressed up as a policeman. He comes in, he's just kind of like. He's trying to talk to members of the family, but everybody's like running around like crazy, and they keep ignoring him. Um, but however, Kevin, now fully aware, of their previous home invasion attempts, he resolves to protect his house from them. So he clearly sets up this series of booby traps to kind of to deter them away, and just and including these tripwires and glue traps, and just strategically like position paintball guns. Just the film expertly balances this humor and suspense. Kevin, with just the ingenuity of a child his age, devises these increasingly elaborate, defenses to keep Harry and Marv from entering the house. Um, but meanwhile, the McAllisters, who are now in Paris, they begin to realize that Kevin has been left behind, and though initially worried, they eventually try to return home as soon as possible. And Kevin, during his time alone, he finds this surprising sense of independence, and just even begins to enjoy his time away from his siblings and his family, who have often teased and ignored him, and just However, like when Harry and Marv, finally managed to break into the house, despite his traps, Kevin is forced to confront this reality, of his missing family. He calls the police, and then this, you know, climatic showdown, he lures the wet bandits to a different house that they had previously, tried to rob. Um, so the film builds, to this kind of heartwarming and satisfying, resolution when Kevin not only, outsmarts Harry and Marv, but also helps reconcile the estranged old man Marley with his family at the end. And I think that further showcases Kevin's growing maturity. And on Christmas Day, the McAllisters finally return, and Kevin is just overjoyed to be reunited with them. And the film's, story seamlessly combines, elements of comedy and suspense and that holiday cheer, making it not just an entertaining spectacle, but just also a meaningful story about family and resilience and just, the spirit of Christmas. Um, so, Home Alone is more than just a Christmas movie. It's that masterful blend of slapstick comedy and suspenseful, sequences and just and heartfelt storytelling that has really earned its place, as a timeless classic. And I think what makes Home Alone so extraordinary is, it's just ability to balance, lighthearted humor with emotional depth, just making it this film that both children and adults can enjoy time and time again. Um, from its its clever plotting to its its standout performances, every aspect of the film I think contributes to its enduring appeal and just ensures its place in that world of just of holiday movies. Um, and I think one of the film's most striking elements is its cinematography, which enhances that Christmas atmosphere, which is a mix of suburban warmth and that kind of wintry grandeur. Just the film's visual style is defined by that stark contrast between Kevin's cozy home and just these icy, expansive streets of Chicago. Um, and just that careful use of lighting from the warm glow of these Christmas lights to these even these eerie shadows in Kevin's house. It all really helps maintain this kind of sense of suspense while kind of also emphasizing that isolation that Kevin feels during his time alone. Um, but particularly memorable, for me, I think are, the outdoor scenes, where the film captures just the beauty of this snow covered neighborhood. These visuals, not only serve as a backdrop for Kevin's adventure, but just also they reinforce, that the idea of that holiday spirit, just making Home Alone feel as much like a winter wonderland as the classic Christmas films that it has influenced. Um, and the performances in Home Alone are equally compelling, with each cast member contributing to the film's charm and its humor. Macaulay Culkin, and this is his breakout role as Kevin McAllister, just delivers this performance that's both endearing and just surprisingly nuanced. He captures that mischievousness of a child who has been unfairly ostracized by his family, while also conveying that vulnerability of of a young boy that's forced to grow up too quickly. Um, his natural acting, which is kind of free from that typical overacting that one might expect from a child in a lead role. It really makes Kevin's journey, from loneliness to heroism, uh, all the more believable, and it's very touching as well. Um, so I don't think, but it would not be complete, but if we talk about Home Alone, um, without acknowledging just the unparalleled comedic brilliance of Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern as the Wet Bandits. Their dynamic is this perfect blend of physical comedy and just that chaotic energy with Joe Pesci in particular, just shining through as that gruff, hot tempered Harry, and Daniel Stern as that ditzy, lovable Marv. Their interactions are filled with these unforgettable moments. From their exaggerated reactions to to Kevin's booby traps, just that they're all these hilariously botched heist attempts. Their performances are so iconic that their characters have become synonymous with the film itself, and just their comedic timing is a key reason why the film remains as funny today as it was back in 1990. Um, just this duo of Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern, just their ability to make even the simplest dialogue sound absurd and entertaining is just a testament, to their skills as actors, and their chemistry with each other and with Kevin is one of the film's greatest strengths. And just and speaking of that humor in Home Alone, it's equally well crafted, just utilizing, like I said, that mix of physical comedy, witty dialogue, and just these clever situational jokes that just kind of keep the audience, engaged throughout the film. Especially with the booby trap sequences in particular, that's a highlight of the film, and it just offers that blend of like slapstick and suspense, and I think that's one of the most overall appeals of this. Because and the humor, it never feels forced either, and instead of merging naturally from these characters and the situations that they find themselves in, whether it's Kevin's like elaborate defenses against the wet bandits, or it's the chaotic scenes at the McAllister home in Paris. um the film's comedy is just expertly balanced, ensuring that it is both laugh out loud funny and just seamlessly integrated into the story. Um, but beyond its humor, Home Alone also showcases um, that real emotional depth. Despite its that the comedic tone, the film just explores themes of family and isolation and personal growth. And I think Kevin's journey from loneliness to heroism is not only a source of entertainment, but just also an emotional arc that resonates with audiences. Um, and the film's resolution, with Kevin reuniting with his family and helping old man Marley reconnect with his own, it really emphasizes that the importance of compassion and forgiveness, and just I think that's what really makes Home Alone more than just a holiday comedy. It's a film that celebrates the power of family and just the joy of spending these holidays together. Um, so I think with that masterful blend of humor and suspense and emotional storytelling, Home Alone remains as a standout Christmas film that just continues to delight audiences for decades now. It's combination of just these performances with and the clever cinematography and just the engaging humor really ensures that it's more than just a seasonal favorite. It's a film that has earned its place in the hearts of fans all around the world. Um, and to follow up on that with Home Alone 2, the success of Home Alone was so monumental that audiences eagerly awaited a sequel that would continue these misadventures of a young Kevin McAllister. So Home Alone 2, Lost in New York from 1992 was that, natural progression in the franchise. It maintained, the holiday, comedy formula while introducing this refreshing new setting. And it was directed by Chris Columbus once again. And the film just kept, these core elements that made the first movie, an absolute hit while expanding, Kevin's journey on a grander scale. So the story, returns to the McAllister family, as they prepare for a new Christmas trip, this time to Miami, Florida. But Kevin once again finds himself alone. Only this time, his accidental journey leads him to the city of New York. Um, the film was produced by John Hughes and it was released by 20th Century Fox, much like the first film, and because they were the same team that just brought the original to life. So why would they not go with them again? So just despite the success of the first film, the sequel had this daunting task of living up to the legacy of the original. However, Home Alone 2 embraced its own identity by kind of setting itself apart with this new location, a different set of challenges, just a more mature tone for Kevin. And Macaulay Culkin returns as Kevin McAllister, now slightly older, and just the film, captured this evolving character, as he learned from his first experience and faced a new adventure on his own. And then you have the return of Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern as Harry and Marv, and it just allowed for that continuation of their iconic dynamic. While new characters and settings ensured the film felt fresh and exciting as well. Um, and New York City, served as the perfect backdrop for Kevin's holiday misadventures, and just the film made full use of the city's landmarks and that festive atmosphere, from the grandeur of the Plaza Hotel to the magic of Central Park, and just the towering presence of the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. The the film captured just the spirit of the city in all of its holiday splendor. Um, and the production team, they filmed extensively in New York. They gave the film, this realistic and immersive quality that just enhanced the viewer's experience. And like I said, it's hard for me to determine which one I like more between the original Home Alone and Home Alone 2. But I always find myself leaning more towards Home Alone 2, because this as a sequel, also allowed for this new visual appeal. And it just contrasted that suburban setting of the first film with these bright lights and this grandeur of a metropolis like city, you know, offering a just a fresh, perspective on the holiday season. And that always felt so appealing to me, especially with like the scenes in Mr. Duncan's toy store. I just I always love those scenes and seeing all the really cool toys and everything. Even though they were pretty much all Christmas themed, I still thought it was such just they were looked so amazing. And there's in one of the Harry Potter films, there's this store that the Weasley that Fred and George open up, and I always wondered if like that how the layout of their store in Harry Potter, if it was inspired by Mr. Duncan's toy store in Home Alone 2. Um, I need to look into that. But, I think a key objective of Home Alone 2 was, to maintain the charm and that humor that made the original so beloved while kind of introducing these new elements that expand the story for both returning and new audiences. And unlike the first film, which focused on Kevin defending his home from intruders, Home Alone 2 gave him the opportunity to explore this new city on his own and learn these valuable life lessons. Along the way, and it managed to deliver that same heart and that humor and that holiday magic, while ensuring that it was not merely a rehash of the first film, but just a worthy continuation of Kevin's journey. um and so to talk about the story of Home Alone 2, like I said, as the McAllister family, prepares for this Christmas trip to Miami, now 10-year-old Kevin McAllister is unhappy with the change of plans. He misses that snowy charm of a traditional Christmas, and after yet another embarrassing run in with his older brother Buzz at this school pageant, he storms off in frustration. And in this moment of exasperation, Kevin wishes to spend the holidays alone. A wish that unexpectedly comes true yet again. After this series of events that prevents him, from boarding the flight with the rest of his family. So he instead gets on the wrong plane, and all of his frustration and oversight, he has his dad's bag that has um, the his dad's credit card and everything inside of it. And so he ends up boarding this flight to New York City, thinking he's going to Miami. But upon his arrival in New York, Kevin's initially frightened by this unfamiliar city, but quickly realizes the freedom and excitement of celebrating Christmas on his own. So with the help of his dad's credit card, he checks into the Plaza Hotel, just treating this luxurious setting as his kind of personal haven for the holidays. Um, However, his independence is soon disrupted when he encounters Harry and Marv. I mean, what are the odds, that Harry and Marv are going have broken out of prison, and now they're in New York City right along with Kevin. Um, so they're plotting to rob this toy store in New York, which is Duncan's toy store, and Kevin, having dealt with them before in the first film, is forced to kind of outsmart them once again to ensure that Mr. Duncan's holiday proceeds, which is intended for this children's hospital, remain intact. Um, and during his time in New York, Kevin also meets this homeless pigeon lady in Central Park, which is a character who becomes this kind of unexpected source of wisdom and support. And this pigeon lady, mistreated by many people in the city, finds solace in her flock of pigeons and just her quiet existence. So Kevin, who's intrigued but initially wary of her, he gradually learns about her past and just the pain that has led her to live on the streets. Um, so their bond deepens when Kevin realizes the value of kindness and resilience, and he encourages the pigeon lady to trust people again. And their relationship not only adds an emotional layer, to the film, but just also, reinforces the idea that even in the busiest of cities, loneliness and compassion can coexist. Um, and so Kevin's mission to stop Harry and Marv from robbing the toy store, takes him on this series of, clever and just chaotic adventures, and just using the knowledge that he gained from the first film. He sets up this elaborate series of booby traps in this abandoned townhouse, which was I think belonged to to like his dad's sister or their cousin or something. I can't remember. But anyway, so he lures the wet bandits into, a trap that kind of mirrors the humor and the slapstick of the original movie. Um, and meanwhile, his family, realizing that he's been left behind, they're traveling to New York to track him down. And this kind of subplot, involving reuniting Kevin with his family, adds this conflict that is, ultimately, resolved through mutual understanding and forgiveness. Um, and the film's climax takes place, at the Rockefeller Center, where the Christmas tree, where Kevin successfully prevents the robbery and reunites with his mother. And after this, heartfelt reconciliation, the McAllisters enjoy this heartwarming, Christmas in New York, proving that while the setting may have changed, the spirit of the holiday remains strong. And in that sense, Home Alone 2, it balances humor, suspense, and that emotional depth, to create this sequel that honors, the original while introducing new characters and settings and themes that just, expand, Kevin's journey and solidify, the film's place as this beloved holiday classic. Um, and it's more than just a sequel. It's a worthy continuation of that holiday magic that really made the first film this unforgettable classic. And while some might question, the need for a follow up to a cultural phenomenon, I think Home Alone 2 more than justifies, its existence by offering this fresh and exciting, new chapter in Kevin McAllister's holiday adventures. Um, and just it maintains that perfect balance of humor and suspense and just, story, that heartwarming storytelling. It expands, Kevin's world beyond the suburban setting, of the first movie, while delivering all of these elements that made the original so beloved. um, from just the cinematography to the performances from the cast here, and just, all these emotionally resonant themes. Home Alone 2 is a Christmas film that really deserves its place, alongside, the original as a modern holiday classic. Um, and I've mentioned it before, but I think one of the most striking aspects of Home Alone 2 is that bold decision to set the story in New York City, which I think is a choice that immediately elevates the film's kind of, visual appeal. Um, and unlike, the snow covered, Chicago streets of the first movie, Home Alone 2, embraces that grandeur and that urban energy of New York, during the holiday season. Um, but the contrast between the kind of quaint suburbia, of the original, and that kind of, dazzling metropolis of the sequel, I think serves to highlight, Kevin's character growth, which is, no longer simply a child left alone by accident, but Kevin is now this slightly older, more independent version of himself from the first film. And he's capable of navigating the city that challenges and enriches, his holiday experience. And the filmmakers really made full use of New York's, iconic landmarks, um, from the Plaza Hotel to the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree, just, giving the audience this visually immersive, experience that just enhances, the magic of the film. um, and just the cinematography in Home Alone 2 is particularly noteworthy, I think, as it manages to, capture both, the the that grandeur of the city and that intimacy of, Kevin's personal journey. The film's opening sequences in New York already establish, this sense of wonder and excitement, and with these kind of wide shots of, the city's skyline and the streets contrasting with just this cozy, warm interiors of the McAllister home back in Chicago. So this kind of visual duality, reflects Kevin's internal struggle. While he wishes for a traditional, snowy Christmas, he finds himself in this completely new environment where he must learn to, adapt and kind of find joy in these unexpected places. And I think the contrast between the cold reality of the city and the warmth of holiday cheer is definitely a recurring theme here. As the way the film uses lighting and color to, evoke these emotions is absolutely masterful. From just the bright lights of Times Square, to the soft glow of a dimly lit Central Park. Home Alone 2 just visually reinforces, just the magic of the season, in those shots. And
The performances in Home Alone 2, like I said, are just equally impressive with Macaulay Culkin delivering, a mature but still endearing performance as Kevin. And while he may have grown slightly older since the first film, his character still remains as clever and independent as ever. But this time with kind of a new sense of confidence, it seems. Um, and the film gives him more agency in his decision making. It showcases this kind of subtle shift from this petulant child of the first movie to this more thoughtful and responsible character. Um, and while the humor in Home Alone 2 is still dominated by the antics of Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern as Harry and Marv, the sequel also gives Kevin, that more emotional depth, and just allowing his character to be, both mischievous and empathetic. And his interactions with the homeless lady, the pigeon lady in Central Park, just really provides this kind of touching subplot that not only highlights the kindness in his character, but also offers this broader message about the importance of compassion and understanding. Um, and just the humor in Home Alone 2 is once again, a major highlight. With the Wet Bandits, who are now known as the Sticky Bandits, delivering the same over the top, physical comedy that made them such memorable characters in the first film. Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern are in top form here. Their interactions with Kevin provide this perfect blend of slapstick and character driven humor. And of all the different like booby traps and stuff that Harry and Marv have fell victim to in the films, my absolute favorite is in Home Alone 2 is when when Marv gets electrocuted, he's like the shelf has fell over on him. He's got all the paint on him, so he grabs like the faucets. It's like hooked up to all this wire in the Kevin's booby trap, and it electrocutes him. And then it shows him like turn into a skeleton, but he still has like the hairy hairdo and his clothes on and stuff. It's hilarious. That's one of my like, I remember like watching that as a kid, and I would rewind the tape like over and over again just to that spot. Um, it's just everything in this is just the all the booby trap sequences are as clever and hilarious as in the first movie, just with Kevin's traps being more elaborate this time, due to his now kind of his greater understanding of how to outsmart the sticky bandits. Um, and That pigeon lady is sexy as fuck. If you say so, bub. But you know, the comedic set pieces in Home Alone 2 are not just for laughs. They are they're also a testament, to Kevin's growth, just showing how he has, learned from, his previous experience and just, improved his, defensive tactics, I guess. The humor in Home Alone 2 is seamless. It enhances the film's excitement without, overshadowing its emotional core. But beyond the comedy, Home Alone 2 also explores themes of family and forgiveness and that personal growth, with the same warmth and sincerity as the first film. And Kevin's relationship with his brother Buzz, um, here, it seems, towards the end, it's a little bit more evolved on both ends, uh, as it kind of handles their reconciliation at the end with grace and humor, showing how the sibling conflicts can be resolved with, understanding and maturity. And I love that about that. And the pigeon lady subplot is especially meaningful, as it reinforces that film's message that kindness can come from unexpected places, and that even those who seem alone can find connection and purpose. These emotional beats ground the film in this sense of realism and depth, and just making
Home Alone 2, more than just a slapstick comedy, it's a film that celebrates the spirit of Christmas in all of its forms. Um, so, with its vibrant cinematography and these stellar performances and just, expertly crafted, humor and emotional heart, Home Alone 2 is a holiday film that not only lives up to the legacy of the first movie, but also stands on its own as this beloved classic. Um, and the with the sequel's fresh setting, the character growth, and just enduring themes ensure that it remains a cherished part of the Home Alone franchise, um, and just a staple of holiday cinema for years to come. Um, and with both of these movies, with Home Alone and Home Alone 2, as a Christmas movie fanatic and just, admirer of everybody that worked on these films, it's impossible to overstate, the enduring impact, of these two films. Uh, they have become more than just holiday classics at this point. There are these cultural touchstones that continue to bring joy and laughter and heartwarming moments to audiences of all ages. And both of these movies, epitomize the essence of the season with their that perfect blend of humor and suspense and emotional depth. And whether it's the clever, booby trap sequences that just have that everybody loves, or these heartfelt, resolutions that just reminded everyone, of the importance of family and kindness. These films have left just an indelible mark on the whole holiday movie landscape. Um, and I think the brilliance of Home Alone and Home Alone 2 really lies in their universal themes and these relatable characters. Just the central narrative of a child left alone during the holidays. It really taps into a shared experience of childhood isolation and just the power of resilience, and just while also offering this holiday message of just coming together and and rekindling your relationships with people, not just family but just people in general. And Kevin's journey from this mischievous boy to a confident and compassionate young hero really resonates with people across multiple generations. Um, his interactions with his family, his interactions with Harry and Marv, and or even old man Marley and the homeless pigeon lady. And they all that showcases the film's their ability to kind of weave humor with these meaningful life lessons. And these elements ensure that the films are not only entertaining but also deeply moving, just solidifying their place in the hearts of fans everywhere. And I think one of the the most remarkable aspects of the Home Alone franchise is that enduring appeal of its cast. Macaulay Culkin, embodied that role uh, of of Kevin with such charm and just authenticity that the character has become, I think, one of the most iconic characters in film history. Um, his performance combined just with that unforgettable chemistry of Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern as Harry and Marv, just it created this dynamic that's just difficult to replicate. And their physical comedy and their just exaggerated personalities, not only elevated the humor but just also made their characters almost too beloved to even hate them. I mean, these are bad guys. These are like what they're doing is wrong, but like you cannot help but love these characters because of just how they are portrayed. And I just think that that shows how amazing actors that Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern are. Um, I mean, you got Joe Pesci, not just in in the Home Alone film, but you have him and movies like Goodfellas and Eight Heads in a Duffel Bag, or My Cousin Vinny. Joe Pesci is a legend, and Daniel Stern is a legend as well. I mean, outside the Home Alone films, I mean he was known in horror films like Chud. He's in Little Monsters with Fred Savage. Um, he's in one of my favorite comedies where he's the star of the film. Is called Bushwhacked. I mean, just everybody that was involved with these films have just become these personalities that that we absolutely love, and just with Harry and Marv in particular, their portrayal of these bumbling burglars remains one of the highlights of both of these films, and just their contributions have left a legacy that is still celebrated by fans today. Um, and to talk about the success of Home Alone 2 is it's also a testament, to their timeless appeal, during the holiday season. Just the magic of these films lies in their ability to, create a sense of nostalgia while remaining relevant in this ever-changing world. From the snowy streets of Chicago just to these bustling lights of New York City, the films they capture the spirit of Christmas in vivid detail, making them this staple of just holiday traditions for millions of households. Um, like I said, whether it's the iconic booby trap sequences or it's just these heartwarming family reunifications, the movies offer this mix of lighthearted fun and emotional resonance that just continues to captivate audiences. Um, but I guess in conclusion, Home Alone 2 are more than just movies for me personally. They're a cherished part, of the holiday experience for countless fans around the world. I mean, I've absolutely loved these movies along with my family ever since I was a very young child. Um, and I know that's the same with so many people in this world, including my wife. This is another one of those special holiday movies, just movies in general for her and her family. This was a movie that her and her Papa Bob, definitely shared, with one another as one of their special films together. Um, and you know, every time we watch Home Alone together, she always mentions, she tells me those stories, and even though I've heard them time and time again, I love hearing them, honestly, because I didn't get to know her Papa Bob for too long while we were together. He passed away shortly after our son Noah was born, but from what I did know him, he was an incredible guy. Had great taste in movies, and just amazing humor as well. So I definitely appreciated that about him. But you know, these movies they have these universal themes, these unforgettable characters, and just that enduring humor that have ensured that they remain beloved, favorites for decades. Um, these films not only entertain but also just inspire joy and connection. You know, as I talked about, not just connection in the movies, but connection with amongst people who watch them together. Um, and it just they have this sense of wonder, during just the most magical time of the year for so many. And as Christmas classics, they will continue to be a part, of that holiday tradition for generations to come. Just celebrating that enduring power of family and kindness and just the magic of the season. Um, but guys, I guess that is it for me for tonight. In this episode, I want to thank all of you who watch this live or if you're here watching on the replay, thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to me ramble about these Christmas movies. It means more to me than you know. But if you would like, please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of the movies I talked about tonight, or if you just have a different favorite Christmas movie you'd like to talk about and comment on. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button down below so you can catch more videos from me like this one. I have another CraterMania Christmas Classics coming up here in a few days, so don't forget to check that one out as well. And also, if you haven't seen any of my other videos on the channel, go back and watch them. Catch me talking about some more movies within these 500 movies I'm talking about in 2025. And as always, click that bell for any future notifications. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.